The loner rancher sent for a mail-order bride, but a giant woman stepped off the wagon. Emmett Sloan had spent the quiet months of late summer rehearsing a future that felt as neat and orderly as his rows of corn. In the picture he carried around in his head, his bride was small and delicate, soft hands for the garden, a soft voice for the long evenings, a presence so gentle it might hush the wind that combed his lonely Texas pasture. He'd even carved a ring from a fallen strip of oak, thin, smooth, and sized to fit the version of her he'd imagined by lamplight. Reality arrived in a wagon shrouded in dust. Fletcher Knox, proprietor of Knox Mercantile, an all-purpose go-between in Dry Creek County, pulled the team to a halt at Emmett's gate. The wheel's spokes clicked once as they settled, and then a tall shadow stepped down. Willa Blaine hit the ground in worn leather boots. The hem of her travel dress dusted the color of road clay. She straightened to her full height, 6 feet if an inch, shoulders broad as a fence brace, forearms corded with work. Her hands were the first thing Emmett truly saw, not fragile, but capable, the kind that could set a post square or gentle a skittish colt. The oak ring in his pocket suddenly weighed twice as much and felt half as right. For a blink, nobody spoke. Heat held the yard still. A locust buzzed in the mesquite by the porch and ran out of breath. 3 months earlier, Emmett had carried a scrap of paper and a pocket full of loneliness into the Gazette office and placed an advertisement with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. In time, letters had come, a careful script that spoke of warm suppers, quiet reading, and the ache of solitude pressing down on an empty house. Willa's words had been steady, practical, and kind. He had read them until the paper went soft at the folds. Not once had she mentioned her height, the breadth of her shoulders, or the strength settled into her bones like good timber. Fletcher climbed down from the driver's box and cleared his throat, eyes bouncing between Emmett's startled face and the woman he'd fetched from the rail depot. "Miss Blaine," he said, flustered in a way that didn't suit a man who could count steers by the hundred with his eyes closed. "Mr. Sloan." Neighbors had drifted over on the pretense of borrowing a plowshare or returning a pie tin. Dry Creek did not waste a chance at spectacle. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stood under a sun-parched parasol, whispering behind her hand. Young Tommy Morrison pointed outright until his mother swatted his wrist. A couple of ranch hands hovered by the fence, grins tucked into their cheeks like tobacco. Willa was the one who found her voice first. "You must be Emmett," she said. Her tone was deeper than he expected, but even, no mockery in it, a hint of a smile that didn't quite commit. She offered her hand. When Emmett put his palm in hers, his fingers disappeared. The grip was firm and strangely careful, like handling a chick that might panic. He felt the calluses, work laid down in honest layers. "I suppose we should talk," she added, glancing at the porch, then at the garden that ran like a green ribbon behind the house. Fletcher busied himself with her trunk, one big slate-colored thing whose weight demanded both arms and a grunt. Emmett took a breath, stood a little taller than he felt, and gestured toward the cabin. "It's not much," he said, instantly hating himself for it. "But it's tight, and the roof doesn't leak." Willa didn't wrinkle her nose at the plank siding or the patched corner where a winter norther had once tried to tear the house apart. She scanned the yard like a rancher, taking in the clean troughs, the tidy woodpile, the careful fence splices on the south line. "You keep things mended," she said, and Emmett felt the words land more kindly than any he'd heard in weeks. Inside, the cabin smelled of soap, coffee grounds, and the faint resin of fresh shaved oak. Emmett set a pitcher on the table and poured 2 glasses. She stooped a hair under the doorframe and ducked in. The room shrank around her size, but her presence didn't crowd it. It organized it somehow, as if a stout beam had been laid under a sagging roof. They spoke in the practical language of strangers testing a path. Willa had grown up on a cattle outfit outside Miles City, Montana, the second of 5, used to colts with more spirit than sense and winters that could judge a person's worth in an afternoon. She had taken work where it came, branding crews, calving sheds, even a little carpentering when there was lumber to be had and a need for straight lines. Emmett told her about Dry Creek's crack summers and the cold that blew in as a rumor and stayed through March. About the bull he bought on a neighbor's advice, Dakota, 2,000 pounds of stubborn with a hide like an old saddle. 2,000, she repeated, measuring the number not with fear but with arithmetic. How are his feet? Sound, Emmett said, surprised by her question. He takes the north pasture like a clock. She nodded once, meaning stored for later. Out on the porch, Fletcher pretended to adjust the harness while giving the yard time to breathe. The neighbors peeled away in clumps, disappointed that no one had shouted, fainted, or fled. Mrs. Henderson left a pie, a very Dry Creek apology for gawking, and a curt reminder that the church social was next week and the invitation still stood. By sundown, the yard had gone quiet but for the creak of leather and the complaining hinge on the screen door. Emmett fetched Willa's trunk, set it just inside the spare room, and stood there searching for a sentence that might bridge the distance between the life he imagined and the one standing in his doorway. I carved a ring, he said before he could stop himself. He took the small wooden box from his vest pocket and set it on the table between them like an admission. From oak. I didn't know your size. Willa lifted the lid, ran her thumb over the smooth grain. The ring caught a lick of lamplight and glowed the color of good coffee. It's beautiful, she said simply. She didn't try to put it on. She didn't hand it back. She rested the box lid beside it, and let the ring be what it was, a promise shaped by hope and imperfect information. They ate in companionable starts and stops, bread, beans, slices of a tomato so red it looked painted. Emmett found himself telling her small things that didn't matter and yet seemed to, how the wind changed at dusk, how the coyotes used the Dry Creek bed like a road, how the locusts went quiet when a hawk circled. Willa listened without reaching for the broom of advice. At the edge of dark, a sound rumbled across the pasture, fence wire singing like a plucked guitar string followed by a thud that had weight to it. Emmett froze. A second thrum ran along the staples and brads of 100 yards of fencing. He was moving before the chair legs finished scraping back. The north line, he said, already halfway to the door. They hit the porch at the same time. Even from there, in the last light, Emmett could see the wrongness, a leaning post, a twisted top strand, and a shape like a boulder on the move where no boulder should be. Downrange, 3 properties over, Mrs. Henderson's front yard was a riot of color all summer long, roses, hollyhocks, the kind of tender flowers that had no business thriving in this country except that she willed them to. In the middle of that garden stood Dakota, massive and black, stomping at a bed of roses as if they'd insulted his mother. Shouts erupted, high, furious, and very much Mrs. Henderson's. 2 men with ropes lurched forward, thought better of it, and scraped backwards over a low picket fence in a tangle of boots and dignity. You can't rope him from here, Willa said, calm as shade beside Emmett. He hadn't heard her step up. She moved quieter than a woman that size had any right to. Her gaze tracked the bull's head, the angle of his shoulders, the white at the edges of his eyes. And they're fixing to get themselves run over if they keep taking his front. Dakota's always been contrary, but... Emmett swallowed the rest. But I can't pull him off a rose bed with willpower. But I am already the story on every porch in town. Shame crawled hot under his skin. Willa stepped off the porch. Not a rush, not a swagger. Long, certain strides that made the yard look shorter and the problem smaller. Emmett, startled, fell into motion after her, his shorter legs pumping to keep up. Willa, wait, he said, breath pinched tight. He's mean when he's rattled. You shouldn't. She didn't break pace. Across the back pasture, through the gap by the cottonwood, and into the alley of weeds that led to the Henderson place. Closed now, Emmett could see what Dakota had made of the garden, roses flattened to pulp, borderstones scattered like children's marbles, hollyhocks snapped at the knees. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch steps, red-faced and righteous. That brute will be the ruin of us all, Emmett Sloan. You'll pay for every... The rest dissolved into the general roar of panic and advice. Willa did not look at the porch. She looked only at the bull. She climbed the fence as if it were a low question and dropped lightly into the yard, empty-handed, palms open, shoulders loose. The crowd sucked in a breath as one. Dakota swung his massive head toward her, the muscle under his neck bunching, hooves grinding Rose canes into paste. He blew a hot blast of air, and the white of his eyes flashed like a warning flag. "Easy, big fella," Willa said, voice pitched low enough to be a comfort and loud enough to be heard. "No whip crack command, no dare. Water over stones." She took one step, then another, every line of her body broadcasting a single message. "I see you. I'm not here to fight." 10 feet. 8. Emmett felt his mouth go dry, felt the useless spring of the rope he hadn't brought, felt every eye and dry creek slide from Dakota to Willa to him, waiting to see which story they would all tell tomorrow. Willa lifted one hand, palm up, the gesture a question and an offering both. Dakota's ears flicked forward. And Willa kept walking. Dakota squared to her, shoulders bunched, breath huffing in hot bursts that stirred petals into little whirlwinds. Willa never looked away. She didn't come at him head-on like the others. She angled her body, slid one boot at a time in a quiet half-circle so the bull always saw her hands and never the threat of a charge. Her voice flowed steady and low, no barked orders, just a patient river of sound. "Easy now, big fella. You're a long way from your pasture, aren't you? Wind spooked you, that it? Easy." The pawing slowed. His ears tipped forward. Willa took another measured step and lifted her palm, open and empty. 10 feet became 8, then 5. When she reached for him, it wasn't at the nose or horn, places that beg a fight, but to the thick muscle behind his left ear, the spot where hide turns to velvet. Her fingers worked small circles there, slow and certain. The bull's massive head sank an inch, then another, a shuddering breath rolling out of his chest like a sigh. Someone in the crowd made a strangled sound. Mrs. Henderson's scolding went to ash in her throat. Without breaking contact, Willa turned her head just enough to be heard. "Could use a lead rope," she said, not loudly but with the kind of confidence folks obey. Fletcher Knox scrambled like a man half his age and returned with a coil from Emmett's tack room. Willa fashioned a simple halter with 3 easy motions, loop, ear, chin, and laid the rope over Dakota's neck as gently as tucking in a child. "Let's go home," she murmured, putting the slightest suggestion into the rope. And that mountain moved. They walked straight down the center of the ruined roses, past border stones kicked catawampus, through a gate that neighbors wordlessly swung wide. Men who'd leapt fences moments ago now parted like prairie grass in a breeze. In the quiet that followed, you could hear the tiny tink of a rose trellis settling. As they passed Emmett, Willa gave him a small, almost shy smile that warmed her whole face. "Your north corner post is soft," she said, as if the moment hadn't been impossible. "Grain's rotten at the base. We'll brace it and reset before dusk." Emmett nodded, throat tight. "Yes, ma'am," slipped out before he could help it. She pretended not to notice, which felt like another kindness. They returned Dakota to the corral. Willa unhaltered him, and the bull, docile now, nudged her shoulder once like thanks before turning to the water trough. Emmett stared at the animal he'd feared all morning as if he were seeing the creature for the first time, not as a test of manhood, but as a problem with parts. Work began on the fence at once. Willa sighted down the line and tapped the loosest staples with the claw end of Emmett's hammer. "We'll do it proper," she said. "String your line tight, post to post, so the eye makes it straight even when the ground lies. Dig past the rot, set your post in rock, not mud. Angle a brace to the corner, and cinch it with wire so she can't pull." She dug like a person who had learned to pace herself, swapping from shovel to digger to tamp in a rhythm that put the tool to work instead of her back. Emmett measured, cut brace rails, and fetched rock. Whenever he reached for weight beyond his comfort, she was there beside him, lifting the bigger half without turning it into a spectacle. When he tied a wire splice, she watched his hands and said, "Clean twist. That'll hold." By afternoon, Dry Creek discovered more reasons to visit than it had people: a returned horseshoe, advice on pumpkins, a spare pie tin. They came in trickles that became a stream, curiosity wrapped in neighborliness. Stories of the garden had outpaced the sun, and every set of boots paused to take in Willa driving a post with a sledge as if she'd been born in iron. Samuel Morrison showed last with his 3 boys drifting behind like a windbreak. He leaned an elbow on the top rail they just strung and said, casual as a drawn pistol, "Heard your lady friends got away with stock." Emmett felt the heat creep up his neck. Morrison was the kind who sorted men into 2 piles, could and couldn't. With Morrison, Emmett always suspected which pile he landed in. "Grew up on a ranch up north," Emmett answered, trying to keep it even. "Knows cattle like a farrier knows feet." Morrison's eldest, big, 19, and used to the world giving way, hitched his belt and stepped forward. "Need a hand with that post-hole digger?" he called to Willa, his voice stitched with the assumption that his help would be both needed and noticed. Willa set the sledge down and tipped her hat with 2 fingers. Sweat had carved a clean path through the dust on her temple. "Kind of you," she said, polite as Sunday. "But I've got my rhythm. If you're looking to help, Mr. Sloane could use a second pair of hands stretching wire. A man on each end saves the Staples grief." The boy's jaw set. He glanced at his father, then at Emmett, and for a moment you could see the math he was doing. How help given to the smaller man felt like a step down, not across. He took the spool anyway. The younger 2 shifted on their heels, unsure where chivalry ended and pride began. "Fence looks stout," Morrison said after a time, maybe because there wasn't much else to say. "Bull won't walk through that again." "Not unless he learns to use pliers," Willa said. Laughter rippled in spite of itself, easing something tight in Emmett's chest. They braced the corner the way Willa had promised. Diagonal rail wedged snug, brace wire twisted into a humming V. Emmett sighted the line and, for the first time since the morning, believed the pasture might hold. Every task found its pair, her weight to his measure, her swing to his square, her reach to his plan. It wasn't that she made him smaller. It was that there was suddenly more of the ranch to carry, and 2 sets of hands to carry it. Neighbors drifted off as the light slanted gold. Mrs. Henderson marched over with a ledger and a look, but left with a repaired gait, a truce, and a promise from Emmett to replant roses from his best stock come fall. "I suppose," she conceded, staring at the bull chewing cud like a repentant altar boy, "that there's no accounting for bovine taste." By the time the last visitor had quit the yard, the sun was a coin resting on the rim of the world. The fence line hummed soft in the cooling air, a kind of music you only hear when the wind drops. Emmett and Willa sat on the porch steps with 2 tin cups of well water between them. Splinters of cedar caught in the cuffs of Emmett's shirt. Gray road dust traced the creases of Willa's knuckles. He wanted to say a dozen things, about the garden, about the quiet way she'd taken his worst fear and walked it back into the corral, about how her smile in the lane had landed like rain on hard ground, but the words stacked up behind his ribs, and refused to go single file. The cricket started first, then a coyote far off, an evening choir that made the world feel wider. Willa set her cup down and watched the violet gather over the pasture. The space between them wasn't empty, it was heavy, like air before a storm, not menacing, just charged. "This is not what either of us wrote down on paper," she said at last, voice low enough that the night almost kept it. She didn't look at him when she said it, and somehow that made it easier to hear. Emmett's mouth was dry. He swallowed, nodded. The truth of it carried no edge. Beyond the north line, Dakota flicked an ear, unbothered now. The problem returned to being a creature. On the porch, 2 people who'd spent months imagining strangers sat beside the people they'd gotten instead, and the day they'd had, wild, embarrassing, impossible, miraculous, settled around them like a blanket. Dark finished falling. Somewhere inside, a small oak ring rested in its box, waiting for whatever shape tomorrow would require. The hush on the porch felt like something they'd both earned. Crickets stitched their thin music along the fence line. A moth battered itself against the lamp glass and gave up. Emmett rolled the cool rim of his tin cup between his palms, searching for words that wouldn't come out crooked. "This isn't what either of us wrote down on paper," Willa had said, and the truth of it made the night feel honest. He let out a breath he hadn't noticed he was holding. "I should have been more clear," he said. About who I am. About what I'm not. What would you have written? Her tone carried no challenge, only curiosity. That I'm shorter than most men in Dry Creek. That rope burns scare me more than I care to admit. That I can mend a hinge better than I can muscle a bull who's made up his mind. He tried for a smile and got halfway there. That I placed that ad because the quiet out here got loud. Willa nodded, head tilted, listening the way stock dogs listen, present, alert, without interruption. And I should have written, she said after a moment, that folks treat me like a spectacle. Like I'm a dare to be taken or a problem to be solved. I can shoe a horse and set a post and turn a rank steer, and somehow that turns into a contest I never asked to enter. They let that sit a while. Out in the dark, Dakota shifted his weight and blew softly, the sound more house than havoc now. Emmett looked down at his hands. They were nicked and stained, yes, but small beside hers, the way a sparrow looks next to a hawk. When I was a boy, he said, my father told me there are only two kinds of strength a good ranch ever needs, the kind that lifts and the kind that lasts. I've always been better at the second. But most days around here, folks only praise the first. Both are work, Willa said. Both are rare. He blinked at that. No one had ever said it plain. A breeze slipped over the porch and turned the lamp flame to a tongue. Emmett stood, went inside without explanation, and came back with the small wooden box. He set it between them. I made it from a fallen oak limb, he said, opening the lid. The ring lay in its little nest, smooth and the color of coffee after the first pour of cream. 3 months. The confession felt like handing over a diary. Willa didn't reach for it right away. She looked at him first, and the look wasn't pity. Then she lifted the ring and turned it, watching the grain glow. It's good work, she said. You sand by lantern or by day? Lantern. I was embarrassed to be seen whittling something that wasn't a fence peg. She slid the ring onto her finger, and it stopped at her second knuckle, just as he knew it would. She didn't force it, didn't apologize. She studied the fit the way she had studied the fence line, fact, not failure. Rings can be cut and warmed and shaped again, she said. That's their whole trick. He laughed, surprised at himself. I suppose it is. Silence again, but it had changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. Willa set the ring back in its box and rested her forearms on her knees. You know what I noticed this morning? She asked. When Dakota broke the north line, you didn't run for Morrison. You ran to tell me. You didn't say it, but your feet decided I was your partner before your head did. Emmett looked out past the porch steps to the fence they had rebuilt together, the brace wire singing a low note in the cooling air. I think some part of me knew you'd see the problem and not the performance. That, and I've known a lot of bulls. The corner of her mouth tugged up. Animal or otherwise. He sobered. Willa, folks are going to talk. Some already are. They'll say I found a woman who can do my lifting for me. They'll say I'm not enough. They'll say things no matter what we do, she said, and there was a flat truth to it that wasn't bitter, just weathered. But they don't eat at our table, and they don't doctor our stock in the cold. She tipped her chin toward the dark pasture. You saw the way Morrison looked at you today, then looked again after we set that corner true? He's revising stories in his head already. He didn't trust his voice for a moment, so he nodded. Maybe I am too. They sat until the lamp burned low. Somewhere in the conversation, they had inched closer along the porch step without noticing. He could smell pasture dust on her clothes and the cedar shavings that clung to his own. Willa drew a slow breath, then spoke with the deliberation of someone choosing a trail in tall grass. We wrote letters that kept us warm, she said. Nice letters. Safe ones. But if we're to make a life, I want the true ones. She tapped the box lightly with one finger. I want to know the hands that carved this. What they can do. What they can't. And I want you to know mine. He felt something loosen in his chest, like a tight knot working free. What does that look like? Trade, she said. Teach me to work wood, properly, not just fence rails. I'll teach you cattle, reading eyes, reading feet, how to move a rank steer without noise. You show me how you plan winter feed. I'll show you how to spot rot at a glance and where to set a brace so the weather has to argue with itself before it argues with your fence. He let out a breath that sounded like relief. I can do that. Good, she said. Because I need something else from you too. The words put a warning bell in his ribs, but her face stayed open. What's that? If this is going to be a marriage, I want it asked proper. Not because we inked a plan with Fletcher or because the Gazette stitched our names together. Ask because you want to. Because it's the story you want told when we're old and tired and too stiff to dance at socials. She nodded at the oak ring, still glowing in lamplight. And I want to resize that with you. I can pull a rasp and mind a line as well as any shop man. Proper, he repeated, the word fitting his mouth the way the ring didn't yet fit her hand. His heartbeat climbed into his throat. Tomorrow, then. After we set that north post hard. Tomorrow, she agreed and rose. The porch step groaned under her weight, the way old wood complains before settling back to rights. At the door, she paused. Emmett? He looked up. Thank you for not stopping me today. I wanted to, he admitted. Every part of me wanted to. But another part knew you didn't need saving. You needed trust. She held his gaze a beat longer, then nodded and slipped inside. Emmett stayed where he was until the lamp guttered and went out, the dark deep as pond water. He listened to the fence sing, to Dakota chew, to the small night things go about their business. The fear that had dogged him since the wagon stopped at his gate was still there, fear of not being enough, of being measured and found wanting, but it sat beside something else now, a clear picture of two hands, his and hers, on the same tool, pulling in the same direction. He closed the ring box and put it in his vest pocket, where it felt less like a mistake and more like a plan. Dawn came clean and early. The north line waited, the brace wire gleaming, and the day had a shape to it, dig, temp, set, tie. After that, something proper to ask, and something true to answer. The morning broke clear, the Texas sun lifting over the mesquite trees with the slow confidence of a judge taking his seat. Emmett Sloan rose early, the oak ring box already heavy in his vest pocket. Sleep had been thin, more tossing than rest, his mind circling the words he knew he had to say. He fed the chickens, checked the water troughs, and stacked wood at the porch, all with the nervous precision of a man rehearsing a proposal in the rhythm of chores. Willa emerged from the cabin just as the light turned gold, her stride long and steady, hair braided back, sleeves rolled high. She carried the post-hole digger in one hand as if it weighed no more than a walking stick. Emmett found himself staring before catching it and turning back to his work. North line, she said simply, tipping her chin toward the corner where Dakota had broken through. They walked the fence line together. The pasture smelled of dew and trampled earth. The weakened post still leaned like a man with bad knees, wire slack and singing faintly in the breeze. Willa tested it with her boot. Rock clear through, she said. We'll dig deep this time. The work began without ceremony. She swung the digger with a steady rhythm, cutting into the clay as though it were no more than bread dough. Emmett hauled rock for the base, measured the depth, and braced the post square with his level eye. Where she had strength, he had detail. Where he faltered, she steadied. It was not loud work, but it was partnership laid bare in the rhythm of shovel and tamp, in the sound of wire tightening true. By mid-morning, the post stood tall and firm, braced against the pull of the fence like a soldier at attention. Willa wiped the back of her wrist across her brow, leaving a streak of clay dust. She looked at him then, not the fence. You've got a careful eye, she said. Some men just drive wood and pray. Yours will hold. The words carried more weight than any praise from the neighbors. Emmett swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the small box pressing into his chest. The timing was there. The air was clean, the work finished, the silence between them not heavy but waiting. His hands trembled as he set the hammer down. Willa, he began, voice low. She straightened, watching him, the distance between them measured in fence wire and what they hadn't yet said. He pulled the box from his vest and opened it. The oak ring glowed in the sunlight, simple and unadorned, but shaped with months of quiet hope. "I carved this after your first letter," he said, words coming halting but true. "I didn't know you." "Not really. But I knew I wanted a partner. Someone who could make me stronger, not smaller. Someone I could trust to sit in the quiet with me, and face storms with me too." Her eyes softened, though her expression stayed steady. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his boots. "Ask me proper," she reminded, her voice low, not commanding but certain. Emmett drew a breath that tasted of clay and cedar. He held the ring out, his hand steady now. "Willa Blaine," he said, his voice stronger with each word. "Will you marry me? Not because the Gazette tied our names in print, not because neighbors expect it, but because I believe we can build something together either of us could build alone." The quiet after his words was vast. The fence sang softly in the wind, a hawk cried high above. Then Willa smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed her face from formidable to radiant. "Yes," she said, simple and sure. Then she held out her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It stuck, as before, at her second knuckle. But she looked down at it with pride, not disappointment. "It'll need resizing," she added. "But I want to do it with you. You'll teach me to work wood. I'll teach you cattle. That's my condition." Relief surged through Emmett so strong it left him light-headed. He let out a laugh that startled even himself. "I'd like that. All of it." They stood there in the sun, side by side, the fence solid, the pasture stretching wide, and the future no longer something imagined in ink but hammered into place with sweat, trust, and the promise of work done together. Autumn rolled into Dry Creek with a blaze of gold on the cottonwoods and a thin coolness in the evening air. 6 months had passed since the day Willa Blaine stepped off Fletcher Knox's wagon, and in that half-year the Sloane Ranch had changed in ways that astonished even its neighbors. Where once the corral sagged, now the lines were straight and braced strong. Where Dakota had trampled roses and sparked gossip, calves now stood healthy and sturdy behind stout rails. The ranch had begun to prosper, not from miracles but from the steady rhythm of two people who had learned to move in step with one another. Willa took to the land as if it had been waiting for her. She could calm a spooked horse with nothing but a touch, and she handled cattle with a quiet authority that even the most stubborn steer respected. Her size, once whispered about in town, became an advantage everyone acknowledged. She swung posts into place that would have taken 2 men, hefted hay bales onto wagons, and drove teams with the confidence of a trail boss. But what surprised Emmett most was how she paired her strength with patience. She never mocked him for his slighter frame, never turned chores into contests. When his careful eye caught a weak seam in the barn roof or a loose board before a storm, she praised his foresight as much as neighbors praised her muscles. Emmett, for his part, grew steadier under her presence. He found himself less worried about how he measured against the men in town. Instead, he learned how to see cattle through her eyes, how the flick of an ear or the shift of weight told you more than a rope ever could. He began to trust his instincts when working beside her, and where once he might have deferred or hesitated, now he spoke up, and she listened. Together they found a balance, his planning in detail with her power and boldness. The neighbors noticed. At first, they came nosing around, curious about the odd pair, their eyes wide as if they were walking into a circus tent. But as weeks passed, curiosity gave way to respect. Fence lines held, stock grew strong, and the Sloane Ranch became a place where work got done and got done well. Even Samuel Morrison, who had once leaned on the fence rail with a smirk, now tipped his hat when passing by, his earlier doubts swallowed by what he saw with his own eyes. By the time October's cool winds swept through the valley, Emmett and Willa decided to marry proper, not just with Fletcher's arrangements and signed papers, but before the eyes of God and their community. The small clapboard church on the rise filled with townsfolk, some curious still, some softened by admiration, all waiting to see if the strangest match Dry Creek had ever whispered about would truly stand. Emmett wore his best suit, pressed so carefully it nearly trembled in its neatness. Willa wore a plain but well-fitted dress, her braid tied with a ribbon the color of autumn leaves. On her finger sat the oak ring, no longer stuck at her knuckle but fitted just right, resized by their own hands in the evenings with rasp and file, the wood polished smooth with oil. Alongside it rested a second band she had carved for Emmett, matched to his size, its grain a twin to hers. When they stood at the altar, the whispers hushed. The minister's words rose steady, but Emmett barely heard them. His focus was on Willa's eyes, steady and unflinching, filled with a warmth that had taken root quietly over months of labor and learning. He thought of the night she had tamed Dakota, of the fence they had rebuilt together, of the evenings on the porch where silence turned into something companionable, even necessary. "I do," she said, her deep voice carrying through the small church with the ring of certainty. "I do," he answered, and for once his voice did not tremble. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the applause that filled the little building wasn't just celebration, it was acknowledgement. What had begun as a spectacle had turned into something stronger, something truer than most had expected. Even Samuel Morrison, sitting stiff in the back pew, nodded once, as though tipping his hat in respect to a man he had once dismissed. That evening, as the valley turned crimson and the wind whispered through the fields, Emmett and Willa walked their fence line together as man and wife. The post stood firm, the wire taut, the land humming with quiet promise. Emmett slipped his hand into hers, small in her grasp, but held as carefully as she had held Dakota's massive head that day in the roses. Neither spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. The ranch itself, the partnership they had built, spoke louder than words. The first winter on the Sloan ranch as husband and wife came harsh and early. Frost silvered the grass before Thanksgiving, and a norther rolled down the plains with a sharpness that cut through coat and glove. In years past, Emmett would have dreaded it, long nights alone with the wind groaning through the rafters, chores stretching heavy on his slight frame, the bull restless in a pen too small. But that winter was different. With Willa beside him, work no longer felt like punishment. When the storm iced over the water trough, she smashed through it with one clean stroke of an axe, while he spread fresh bedding in the barn stalls. When hay needed hauling, she carried the heavier loads while he stacked them with neat precision, ensuring air moved through the bales and kept them from molding. Their strengths dovetailed like teeth of a well-cut gear. What once might have broken him down into weariness now felt like rhythm, partnership made tangible in every task. Neighbors stopped by through the season, sometimes bringing pie, sometimes looking for advice. No longer did they treat the Sloan ranch as a curiosity. They came because fences stayed upright, calves were healthy, and a strange kind of peace hung around the place. Folks noticed how Willa spoke of we instead of I, how Emmett listened with care and answered without defensiveness. The Morrison boys, once stung by pride, now asked Emmett about planting rotations and came to Willa for lessons in horse handling. Respect had replaced gossip. By spring, their land showed the results of shared labor. The vegetable garden grew thick, the herd calved strong, and even Dakota, once the terror of Dry Creek, grazed calmly behind braced rails, more docile under Willa's quiet hand than Emmett would have believed possible. One evening, as the sun slid red across the horizon, they sat together on the porch, Dakota's shadow moving slow in the pasture. Willa rested her large, calloused hand on his, the oak ring gleaming against the fire of the sky. "Funny," she said, her voice carrying the rough kindness he had grown to love. "How a thing that started as loneliness could turn into this." Emmett smiled, small but steady. "I used to think strength was measured in what a man could lift. Now I know it's measured in what two people can carry together." They fell quiet, letting the chorus of crickets and the soft creak of the new fence fill the silence. Emmett felt no embarrassment, no shrinking against her shadow. He felt, for the first time in his life, whole. 6 months later, the church bells rang again in Dry Creek, this time not for vows but for celebration. Under their combined hands, the Sloan Ranch had become one of the most productive spreads in the county. Neighbors gathered not to gossip but to learn, to borrow techniques, to share meals. The whispers of odd couple had vanished, replaced by nods of admiration. And when Emmett and Willa stood side by side at the church picnic, passing plates of food to children who scampered around the tables. It was clear to anyone watching that their marriage was not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate, living partnership. The oak rings they wore, once awkward in fit, now carved to perfection by their own hands, shone as symbols of a truth their neighbors had come to understand, that strength is not the size of a man's shoulders, nor the power in a woman's arms, but the bond that lets two people stand taller together than either could alone. As twilight deepened and laughter carried over the prairie, Emmett looked at Willa and felt the weight of solitude he had once carried vanish completely. What had begun as ink on paper had become a life, imperfect, unconventional, but bound tight with respect, work, and love. And in that wild country, where storms came hard and neighbors judged quick, Emmett Sloane and Willa Blaine had built something stronger than fences. They had built a partnership that could weather anything.